we are going to be talking to a former teacher. She has taught in schools in Bridgwater, Taunton, Street and Wells, and she thinks that because of the way that, the world was for the last 2 years, the way that it affected people of school age, the distractions, the way that the school terms were all very disjointed. The school was on, it was off again. So she's thinking that it now might be the ideal time to reassess how we teach children and put more emphasis on nurturing emotional well-being. So we'll find out when we talk to Leonora Langley very soon indeed about how she thinks we could go about doing that and why she thinks it's necessary. But obviously teacher for many years, something must have made her think, I want to get into teaching. Possibly it was because she had a brilliant teacher. Maybe you had a brilliant teacher. Someone who at school was different to all of the other teachers. Might still have been strict, might still have been someone who kind of, made you work hard, but did it in a way that meant that you kind of got their way of teaching and they got your way of learning. Teachers, obviously, homework, stress, exam anxiety. For the young people who are at school at the minute, though, because of the 2 years that we've had, it has been a very different education that's been on offer. And what we're learning from home, what we're doing things virtually, is now a good time to sit and think about the way that school is, because whether you liked it or not, school shapes who we become. Well, Leonora Langley has taught in schools all over Somerset, Wells, Street, Bridgwater and Taunton, and she feels so strongly about her experience as a teacher, she's written about it. Let the Souls of Our Children Sing is the book which is all about nurturing emotional well-being in our children. Leonora, good morning.
Good morning, Simon. Lovely to connect with you.
And nice to have you here as well. Thank you so much for coming on. Obviously the timing of this is pretty crucial because obviously education has changed over the years. There have been different curriculums, there have been different governments that have had different targets to assess, but nothing like a pandemic has ever happened to education before. And so you think now is a good time to look at what we're doing and think of other ways of doing it?
Absolutely. The influence of COVID and the pandemic seemed, in a sense, so negative. But despite the unprecedented challenges that COVID presents us with over the past 2 years, maybe there was a positive aspect, because I think it shook us all up to the very core and made us think deeply about what matters most in our lives. I say that because I believe it's through adversity and challenge that we learn the most. During the pandemic, we were forcibly confined as if in a chrysalis, facing some very dark and challenging times. As a result of the restrictions of lockdown, I think we're now better able to appreciate the light, if you like. Coming out of the worst of the pandemic, we've been presented with a real opportunity to reassess and reset traditional protocols, including our mainstream education, which desperately, I think, needs a new paradigm, a shift in emphasis to include and meet the emotional and mental health needs of the present generation, the so-called COVID generation of young people.
Well, certainly COVID forced us to rethink the way that things were done, forced us to be inventive, forced teachers to be creative. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's go back to the past. And did you have a teacher who you loved? Was there someone who inspired you to get into the profession ultimately?
So very, very good question. And I often think of this, Simon. There was one teacher in my junior school who took me on nature walks and taught me penmanship, how to have a beautiful hand. And still, when I write on the board for children in schools, they say, "Miss, why is your handwriting so neat?" And I think back to this lovely teacher who was really non-judgmental, loving and connecting and caring. And then in my secondary school, there was another teacher who taught English, and she definitely inspired me to become a journalist.
Well, journalism became a big thing in your world, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. But when you decided you wanted to become a teacher, what was it that fueled that thought?
That's such a good question again. So here I was in my 20s. I dabbled with other professions, because my dad died when I was 16, and that was a big upheaval in my life emotionally. But in my 20s, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. He'd been a teacher of music. And I went into a school of 6 to 7-year-olds on my very first teaching practice. And I really wanted to make a difference. I was aware of children's vulnerability. They were so impressionable. But more than that, I felt that they were at the mercy of their parents and teachers, and probably society at large too. That was a very, very formative time of my life. But it wasn't until much later on, when I became a counsellor and a parent, that I felt better qualified to write this book about the emotional well-being of our children.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? The point of becoming a parent means you see it through different eyes. You certainly approach the way that education works and the effects that it has on the young person in your life slightly differently.
Well, I believe that children teach us as much as we teach them. My son has pulled me up on many occasions saying, "Mum, oh, you always seem to know it all. You know, you could never acknowledge that you might be wrong." I've really had to take on those two issues in particular because I'm quite an assertive woman. I've had some very demanding jobs, if you like. And so it made me look at me more. It's a mirror, isn't it, when we have children? And if we don't let them know that we are vulnerable ourselves and that we've been children, and let them know that we know what it's like to walk in their shoes and get into their frame of reference, then we've kind of lost them, I think.
Teachers, I always think it must be one of the hardest jobs in the world, particularly if you are teaching a class of older pupils. The fact that at any moment 30 people could turn on you. You know, we know that there are certainly people who, when I was at school, who were cheeky and a bit irreverent, and I suspect there is more of that in schools now. There's the ongoing problem of, right, put your phone down. There's also the backroom stuff of, right, this is what you've got to teach. This is the curriculum. We've changed it this way. This is where the focus is, and these are the targets that we're aspiring to. It must be one of those jobs that you have to love to stick it out.
Definitely. I've taught in some of the most challenging schools, right at the rock face of our society. I lived in Brighton at the time, and I was director of music at a very challenging school. And I just had to dig so very deep to try and reach these children who were a bit disillusioned. We were living very close to the beach. That there were people in some of the classrooms that I taught, they hadn't even been to the beach, even though they were only half a mile away. So that really had an enormous effect on me. And I was so keen to try and make their lives better and more enriched. So I put on a production of Grease, which they were totally into, and then I took them to Glyndebourne Opera House. 11 of my students got into principal roles in a children's opera, and it completely changed their lives. And I grew very, very close to a lot of the children. I didn't reach them all. I tried to. There are going to be some who just seem unreachable, but maybe I made more of an impact on them than I'll ever know. I don't think teachers quite realise the absolute importance of their job. They need to be connecting, caring, and loving, not in the way that we love our partner or our own children. The agape love that the Greeks talk about, the unconditional positive regard for everybody who comes into our lives. And I just feel that sometimes teachers are a little bit aloof. It's a bit of a them and us approach rather than the co-creative approach that I so believe.
But to be fair to the teachers, is that just because that is how the system is set up at the minute?
Of course, since the 1870s, Simon, our education system has barely moved away from the Victorian ethic, a 19th century model of too much emphasis on cognition and logic, because it can be counted and measured over the emotional development of our children and the nurturing of their souls, which of course is beyond measure. So for the past 150 years, we've had two main aims of education: the transmission of a body of knowledge and cultural values from one generation to another, and then the creation of a productive workforce. But I think education needs to be about the development of self-actualization, as described by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, both humanistic psychologists. We need to help our children develop a true sense of self-awareness, self-compassion, and self-love, integrating the physical, intellectual, social, spirit, and especially the emotional.
We know that schools have, in recent times, many of them now have counsellors who are there to deal with as many of the issues as they can, with as many of the pupils as they can. But schools are vast. You know, secondary schools have got thousands of pupils. It's almost going to be an impossible task to be able to, on the one hand, give them the education that someone somewhere, whether it be the government, whether it be Ofsted, decrees that they need, and on the other hand to be the touchy-feely, hands-on, friendly face of growing up as well. How do you straddle both of those things?
It is almost an impossible task, but I believe that where there's life, there's hope. So we need to change the emphasis. We need to let children know that we understand them. We really need to listen to their issues. Sometimes we just dismiss them because teachers are on overload all the time. It's too much about competition. It's all too mechanical, prescriptive, sedentary, and I think soul-destroying, not just for the children, but also for the teachers who have to deliver it. I think children are being over-tested, over-homeworked, over-pressurized, resulting in a generation of children who experience too much stress and anxiety, which can lead to depression, self-harming and suicidal ideation. Now, there are parents who want to see results. They're keen for their children to get A stars and to get a really good start in life so that they can go to a good university, find a really good career. But all that, I think, Simon, is about teaching children to live in their heads, in a head narrative. We need to encourage children to feel through their entire body. Otherwise, I think they're going to have problems later on.
Also, having a path to follow is quite an interesting thing, that if you are someone who is driven and ambitious, then it sort of helps you get through because you know where you want to end up. And perhaps there are many young people who quite rightly have no idea and just want to sample the delights of the world before they settle down with all of the responsibilities that go with being a grown-up. You've been very fortunate that, as well as being a teacher, you did some journalism work that took you to some amazing places.
I loved the children from the get-go. What I didn't like so much, Simon, I did 3 years in my 20s in junior schools. What I didn't like so much was the system. I found it too restrictive, too prescriptive for me as a young person. And I just had to go and find myself, if you like. So I had an opportunity to be involved with journalism. I did all my training in London as a freelancer, some amazing experiences. And gradually I realised, because I'm very much in touch with the human condition, that's been a lifelong interest, I decided that I liked to interview people. And so I became known a bit as a celebrity interviewer. And then I had an opportunity to go to Los Angeles, kind of fell in love with the entrepreneurial spirit over there. And of course, it was the heart of the entertainment industry. And I went on an assignment, knew I had to go home, did come home to London, sorted things out, went back 6 months later, and I didn't return for 7 years.
Wow.
I started a small supplement for the Hollywood Reporter, which is the Bible of the entertainment industry, and it grew to a 184-page freestanding magazine. It was such a challenge. I was out of my comfort zone every single day. And through that experience, Simon, I did reach what I felt was self-actualization. I didn't have anybody to turn to. And obviously there were people who were kind along the way, but it's a bit of a barracuda land out there. And I really had to dig so very deep within myself to succeed. And then I went on to become the West Coast editor for Elle, the fashion magazine, Elle USA, for 3 years. And basically, my feet didn't touch the ground. But because the heart of me is about helping others, I felt that was the end of an era. And I actually went back to teaching when my son was young. And I'm really pleased that I did, because now I like to make a difference. I'm a different person from that young, wanting a bit of glamour in my life individual. And I'm really glad that I did my early training as a teacher and was able to go back to it. And it really fitted in well to my looking after my son.
Well, it's been really interesting talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time. The book is called Let the Souls of Our Children Sing, all about nurturing emotional well-being in our children. Leonora, thank you for coming on. Really nice to meet you today. Obviously, the way that education works has been slightly different over the last 2 years, and the government at the end of March released its first schools white paper in 6 years. It set out that the school week should be 32 and a half hours, promised that Ofsted will inspect every school by 2025, pledged to make every school part of a multi-academy trust by 2030. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said literacy and numeracy are the building blocks of a world-class education. They unlock the learning, knowledge and skills that every child needs to succeed in later life. If your child falls behind in school in either of these key subjects, their school will help them get back on track. We also, as we mentioned in the chat we had with Leonora, we know that schools are introducing counsellors. They are allowing students the time to talk if they have issues as well. So if there's anything you want to say about what we've been talking about, then you're more than welcome to get in touch. And if it's brought back memories of your school life and maybe a teacher who made a difference to you, call us, text us, email us, WhatsApp us. We would love to hear from you, please.